I was folding laundry when the message came through. Just a short text from my son, but it hit like a punch to the chest. Please don't come to my graduation, Mom. I don't want any scenes. At first, I stared at the screen, thinking I must have misread it. My thumb hovered over the message, waiting for a second part that would soften the blow. Some kind of joke or follow-up that said, "Just kidding, of course you're coming." But it never came. I held my breath, rereading those words over and over. My heart was thudding in my ears. I sat down on the edge of the couch, laundry forgotten, trying to make sense of what I'd just read. What kind of scene did he think I'd make? Was it the way I dressed, my voice, my job at the grocery store? Or maybe it was just me, my presence, my history, my face. Maybe I embarrassed him now. Maybe I'd always embarrassed him, then I was just the last one to know. I typed a reply. "What do you mean?" and erased it. I typed again. "Of course I won't. I love you." Then erased that too. What was I supposed to say? This was the boy I'd raised alone for 22 years. I was there for every scraped knee, every science fair, every fevered night. I packed his lunches, sold my wedding ring to pay for his textbooks, and worked double shifts to help him afford a school sweatshirt with his university's name on it. That sweatshirt, the one I had folded just minutes ago, was still warm from the dryer. I ended up replying with just 2 words. "Okay, understood. I didn't want to guilt him. I didn't want to make it worse. If he thought I would embarrass him, maybe the best gift I could give him was silence." I folded the last of the laundry, each shirt, a memory, the blue one with the bleach stain. He wore it to that college tour when he was 16, the one where he turned to me and said, "Someday I'll walk across that stage and make you proud." Proud, I had always been proud of him. But now, I wasn't sure if he felt the same about me. I sat in that quiet house for a long time. I didn't cry, not yet. I was too stunned for tears, too hollow. The kind of silence that presses on your ears like the whole world is underwater. I looked around. There was no cap and gown hanging on the door, no airline tickets on the counter, no hotel confirmation, just a folded stack of shirts, a tired woman sitting beside them, and a message that had changed everything. This was the moment I realized I was being uninvited from my own son's biggest moment, and he didn't even think it was cruel. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Because this is the story of what happened when I stayed home from my son's graduation and how he said my name in front of 1,000 people with tears in his eyes. Before that message, before that silence, before that aching loneliness on graduation day, there was something else. There was us, me and Zach, the inseparable duo. We weren't perfect, far from it. But we were close in a way that made other people stop and notice. From the time he was a toddler, Zach clung to my side like a second heartbeat. After his father left, when Zach was just 3, it was just the 2 of us against the world. We built a rhythm, a little life that felt whole even when it technically wasn't. Every morning, I'd wake up before dawn to get ready for my shift at the grocery store. I'd make him breakfast eggs if we had them, toast with cinnamon sugar if we didn't, and slip a note into his lunchbox. Silly drawings, knock-knock jokes, quotes I thought might make him smile. He kept them too. I once found a shoebox under his bed filled with the crumpled notes I thought he'd thrown away. That shoebox told me I was doing okay. After school, I'd pick him up and we'd go to the park or the library, or we'd sit in the kitchen doing homework together while I prepped dinner. I made games out of spelling tests. He made me laugh when I was too tired to keep my eyes open. It wasn't easy, but it was ours. The kind of small, quiet life that looks simple on the outside, but holds decades of love inside. When money got tight, I found ways to make it stretch. I cleaned houses on the weekends. I fixed hand-me-down clothes with patches and thread. I even taught myself how to fix leaky pipes and reset tripped fuses because I couldn't afford a handyman. Zach never complained. He once told a classmate during a playdate, "My mom can do anything." I still remember that. Every school event I was there. I never had the best outfit. Sometimes I was the only parent who came straight from work, aprons still in my bag, shoes worn at the soles. But Zach always looked for me in the crowd. He'd wave with that big, proud grin, the one that made everything, the shifts, the loneliness, the unpaid bills, worth it. High school came faster than I expected. He started pulling away a bit, but I chalked it up to teenage moods. Still, he always came to me when things went wrong. When he got his first rejection letter from a summer program, we sat in the car for an hour and just talked. When his first girlfriend broke up with him, we watched movies all weekend, eating too much popcorn and pretending we weren't both heartbroken. When he got accepted into university, a top-tier school in Boston, I screamed so loud the neighbors thought something had happened. I cried on the kitchen floor, clutching the acceptance letter, knowing everything we'd worked for was finally paying off. He'd done it. We'd done it. And when he told me he didn't want to take out loans, that he couldn't bear the debt, I took out a second job, a night cleaning shift at an office downtown. He didn't know. I didn't want him to. I told him we'd be fine, and I made it true. I believed deep down that one day he'd stand on that graduation stage and see me in the crowd. My tired eyes, my worn shoes, my calloused hands, and feel everything. I'd given everything we'd built together. I imagined the moment, often him in a cap and gown, scanning the crowd for me, eyes locking, smile spreading. Maybe he'd mouth, "Thank you." Maybe he'd say it out loud in his speech. I never imagined a message telling me to stay home, because until that moment, I thought we were still that same team. I thought the foundation of our life, the notes in his lunchbox, the shoebox under his bed, the nights I held him through fevered dreams, meant something that couldn't be erased by time, distance, or success. That was my mistake. I thought I was still welcome in the story I helped write, and that's what made his message so unbearable, because before the silence, before the hurt, before the ceremony, I never attended. There was a mother who gave everything, and a son who used to call her his hero. Looking back, the first red flag didn't come in the form of a message or an argument. It was subtle, a moment I almost missed, tucked inside an otherwise ordinary weekend. It was Zach's first semester in college. He'd only been gone a couple of months, but the silence already felt louder than it should have. The calls came less frequently. The texts turned into one-word answers. "Yeah, busy later." I didn't want to seem needy, so I gave him space. After all, this was what I'd worked for, to give him a life where he didn't have to worry about me. Still, when he called and asked if I could visit for parent weekend, I lit up like a Christmas tree. I bought a bus ticket from Ohio to Boston, packed some of his favorite snacks, and brought along a photo album I'd been putting together. Pictures from kindergarten to prom, just to remind him how far he'd come. I was nervous when I arrived on campus. The buildings were massive, the students brisk and polished. I felt out of place in my department store jacket and scuffed flats, but I held my head high. I was here for him. Zach met me at the main gate. He looked different, older, maybe more polished, like the campus itself. He gave me a quick hug, short, distant, then pulled me along, walking fast. "We're gonna meet a few people from my dorm," he said. "Just be cool, okay?" "Of course," I said, trying to laugh it off. "Have I ever not been cool?" He didn't smile. We walked into a courtyard where a group of his friends were gathered, tall, laughing, wearing crisp jackets and expensive watches. Zach introduced me quickly, barely making eye contact. "This is my mom," he said, and then moved on to talk about his classes. One of the guys said, "You from Boston too, ma'am?" I shook my head. "No, Ohio. I work at a market there." Zach laughed sharp and strange and said, "Yeah, she's kind of a small-town legend." Something in his tone stung. The way he said legend felt like a joke, not a compliment. I smiled, but something inside tightened. Later that afternoon, we went to a local cafe. I offered to pay, but Zach stepped ahead and tapped his card without looking at me. "You've done enough," he said, not unkindly, but with a tone that sounded more like dismissal than gratitude. As we sat down with our drinks, I pulled out the photo album from my bag. "I made this for you. Just memories, don't worry, no baby bathtub pictures." He glanced at it, then slid it back toward me without opening it. "Thanks, Mom, but I really don't need that here. You know space is tight." It was the way he said that, like it was a burden, a reminder of a life he didn't want to show off. I nodded, tucking it back into my bag, feeling like I'd brought a childhood toy to a business meeting. On the way back to his dorm, I offered to walk him all the way in, but he hesitated. "Actually, I'll just go from here," he said, standing a few feet away from the building entrance. I looked up at him. "You sure I came all this way?" He cut me off. "Yeah, it's just, people are around and I've got stuff." I hugged him, even though he didn't lean in. I told him I loved him, and he mumbled, "Love you too," over his shoulder, as he walked away. I stood there for a moment, holding the bag with the untouched photo album, watching him disappear into a world that suddenly felt very closed off to me. On the bus ride home, I tried not to cry. I told myself he was just adjusting, just growing up. I made excuses. New environment, new pressures, new friends. Maybe he didn't mean anything by it, but deep down, a small voice whispered something I didn't want to hear yet. He was ashamed of me, not because of anything I'd done wrong, but because of who I was, what I looked like, what I represented. I was the reminder of where he came from, and he was trying to leave that behind. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel. But it was the first time I felt like I didn't belong in my own son's life. A quiet rejection. A door not slammed, but quietly closed. And I didn't even knock again. After that visit to his campus, things didn't improve. They didn't fall apart all at once either. That would have been easier, maybe even kinder. Instead, they unraveled slowly like a thread pulled from the hem of an old sweater. Little by little, without fanfare or finality, I started disappearing from Zach's life. It began with the holidays. Freshman year, he came home for Thanksgiving. I cleaned the entire house top to bottom, made his favorite dishes. Mac and cheese with the crusty top honey-glazed carrots, and the chocolate pecan pie he used to beg for every November. I even bought a new tablecloth, something bright and clean, trying to make everything feel special. He arrived with his new girlfriend, Emily. Polite, thin-lipped, and constantly checking her phone. She barely looked up when I greeted her. Zach kissed my cheek quickly, called me Mom like it was a placeholder instead of a name, and complimented the house without looking at it. During dinner, I asked if he'd gotten the care package I sent. Homemade cookies, wool socks, a small handwritten note tucked in with a photo of us from his high school graduation. He shrugged. "Oh yeah, it was nice. But I don't really need stuff like that anymore." Emily chuckled and said, "Yeah, Zach's not really into sentimental stuff." I nodded and smiled, swallowing down the sting with a sip of wine. But that night, when I was alone in the kitchen washing dishes, I opened the trash can and saw the card I had written. Unopened, folded inside the package exactly as I'd sent it. I didn't ask him about it. Second year, he didn't come home for Thanksgiving at all. Said he was too busy, too many papers due, and Emily's family had invited him to Cape Cod. "It's just easier," he said over the phone. "Less pressure." You know, I told him I understood, and I meant it. I just didn't tell him that I ate a turkey sandwich alone in my living room that year. When Christmas rolled around, he sent a generic gift, a coffee mug that said, "World's Okest Mom." I laughed when I opened it, even though no one else was in the room. It wasn't mean-spirited. It was just detached. Like he picked it out last minute from a clearance shelf and never thought twice about what it would feel like on the other end. He called on New Year's Eve to wish me well, but didn't ask what I was doing or if I had plans. I didn't. I sat by the window with a blanket and a glass of wine, watching other people's fireworks, pretending the silence didn't ache. There were no big arguments, no screaming matches, just a quiet replacement of closeness with distance. Our conversations became surface level. I'd ask how classes were, and he'd give one-word answers. I'd ask about his future plans, and he'd say, "Still figuring it out." I stopped asking about Emily because I could tell he didn't want to talk about her with me, or maybe he didn't want to talk about me with her. Even the way he said Mom changed. It used to have warmth, like it meant something. Now it felt like a formality, a duty, something he said because he had to, not because he wanted to. I used to be the person he came to for everything: fears, dreams, heartbreaks, advice. Now I was someone he updated like a distant relative you send a postcard to out of obligation. The emotional erosion wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and sharp like paper cuts. You don't notice them at first, but they sting when you least expect it. I'd scroll through social media and see photos of him with his friends' trips. I hadn't heard about new internships. He hadn't mentioned birthdays. He didn't tell me he was celebrating. He was building a life, and I wasn't even in the blueprints. One evening, I found myself talking out loud to the photo of us on the mantel. He was about 9 in the picture, arms wrapped around my neck, smiling so wide his cheeks puffed up. I whispered, "Where did you go?" But he hadn't gone anywhere. I had. Not physically. I was still here. Still the same woman who raised him, who stitched the holes in his socks and stayed up all night when he had a fever. But somewhere along the way, I had been quietly written out of his story. And the worst part was that I couldn't even say when it happened. There was no goodbye, just silence, filling the space where love used to live. The moment that truly broke something in me didn't happen on a stage or in front of a huge crowd. It happened in my own kitchen, in my own home, where I'd poured years of my life into building a place of love, warmth, and welcome. That was what made it so painful. It was supposed to be a safe space. Instead, it became the site of a quiet humiliation I'd never forget. It was the spring break of Zach's 3rd year in college. He texted 2 days before arriving, saying he'd be coming home for a long weekend, just him and Emily. No big plans, just a visit. My heart soared. I hadn't seen him in months, not since a rushed lunch over winter break, when he barely looked up from his phone. The idea of having him back in the house even briefly lit something inside me I hadn't felt in a long time. I spent 2 full days preparing. I deep cleaned every room, scrubbed the baseboards, changed the sheets in his room, and stocked the fridge with all his childhood favorites: root beer, cheddar, popcorn, cinnamon rolls. I made stew from scratch, the way my mother used to, the way Zach always asked for when he was sick or stressed. He walked in with a duffel bag and a backpack slung over his shoulder, Emily right behind him. She didn't even say hello, just scanned the living room like she was assessing a rental. Zach kissed my cheek in a distracted way, his eyes already on his phone. "Place looks the same," he said flatly. "I try to keep it nice," I said. "I'm so glad you're here." They dropped their bags in the guest room. Not his old bedroom, I noticed, and emerged, looking bored, like they were stuck somewhere inconvenient. That night, I made dinner. Stew, fresh biscuits, and roasted vegetables. I lit candles, not too formal, just warm, comfortable family. We sat down at the table and I said, "Let's say grace." Zach looked up confused. "Grace?" "Yes," I said, "like we always do." Emily raised an eyebrow and smirked. "You guys pray before dinner?" Zach chuckled, shaking his head. "It's kind of a tradition. I mean, not really serious." My heart thudded. I looked at him. "You used to love saying grace." "That was when I was like 10, he said with a shrug. "It's not really my thing anymore." Emily laughed. "It's kind of cute, though, like a country postcard." "A country postcard?" I smiled politely, even as the words cut deep. I swallowed my response, picked up my spoon, and said, "Well, let's eat then." They barely touched the food. Emily said she didn't eat meat. Zach said he wasn't hungry. They left the table early, saying they were tired. I cleared their barely touched plates alone. Later that night, I overheard them talking in the guest room. "The walls in this house are old. They let everything through." Emily was whispering, amused. "Your mom's sweet, but this place is like a time capsule. I feel like I stepped into a Hallmark movie from the 90s. Zach laughed. Yeah, I keep telling her to get with the times, but she's stuck in her ways. I mean those curtains, Emily added. And that stew. More laughter. That night, I stood in the dark kitchen, hands in the dishwater, listening to them laugh at the life I'd built with my bare hands. I didn't say anything to them the next morning. I acted like everything was fine. I made pancakes, poured orange juice, and asked how they slept. I kept my smile in place like armor, but something shifted. Not in them. They had already shifted. In me. For the first time, I stopped making excuses for Zach. I stopped telling myself he was just busy, just young, just figuring himself out. For the first time, I realized that somewhere along the line, I had become a joke to him. A sweet, outdated joke. I wasn't just hurt. I was ashamed. Not of myself, but of how much of myself I had handed over to someone who no longer saw me clearly. It wasn't a slap or a scream or a dramatic betrayal. It was worse. It was the casual dismissal of everything I'd ever done. Everything I was. And it happened in my kitchen over a plate of untouched stew. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just being left behind. I was being erased. After that visit, something inside me went quiet. Not dead. Not yet. But quiet in the way a house goes still, after the guests leave, after the lights are out, when all you can hear is your own breathing, and the clock ticking, and the heaviness that settles when you realize someone you love no longer sees you the way they used to. Zach didn't say anything cruel before he left. There wasn't a confrontation, no slammed doors, no accusations. He hugged me briefly, said thanks for everything, and walked out the door with Emily. She didn't even say goodbye. But it wasn't about what he said. It was about how light his goodbye was, like it cost him nothing to let me go. I stood by the window as they pulled out of the driveway, waving even though they didn't look back. I held that wave until their car disappeared down the street, until I could no longer pretend they might turn around. Then I went back inside, walked to the kitchen, and started clearing away the dishes from breakfast. The silence was so loud I thought I might scream just to cut through it. Instead, I sat down at the table, hands in my lap, and just stared at the empty chairs. The candles from the dinner 2 nights earlier were still sitting on the shelf, half burned. The napkins were still folded neatly in their rings. I hadn't had the heart to put them away. And I realized something. I wasn't just uninvited from parts of his life anymore. I was being phased out gently, quietly, like I was no longer necessary. Like I was a page from an earlier chapter that didn't fit the narrative anymore. He didn't hate me. He just didn't need me. Maybe didn't even want me. I didn't cry right then. There was no explosion, no dramatic unraveling, just a heavy kind of stillness. The kind that settles on you when you finally accept something you've been trying not to see. For the next few weeks, I stopped reaching out. Not as a punishment. I wasn't playing games. I just didn't have the energy anymore. I used to text him every few days. Funny pictures, check-ins, notes about a movie we both loved. He used to reply, then he didn't, and I got the message. Slowly, one unanswered text at a time. I stopped sending care packages. I stopped offering to visit. I stopped asking when he'd be home next. I stopped trying. At work, I smiled through my shifts, bagging groceries for people who probably thought I was just another middle-aged woman passing time. They didn't know that I used to be someone's whole world, that once upon a time I was the hero of a little boy's life. Now I was barely a footnote. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I thought I'd be furious and that I'd feel betrayed or indignant. But all I felt was tired, deeply, painfully tired. One night, I sat on the edge of my bed, holding a box of old letters Zach had written me. Birthday cards, Mother's Day notes, sticky notes from grade school. There was one where he'd drawn a picture of me with a crown and wrote, "My mom is the queen of everything." I folded it back into the box. and gently closed the lid. That was the night I decided something. Not out of rage or revenge, but out of quiet clarity. I was done chasing a version of him that no longer existed. If my presence was something to be managed hidden or apologized for, then maybe it was time I gave him what he clearly wanted: distance. 2 weeks before his college graduation, I got the message, a simple text. "Hey Mom, just wanted to say, it might be better if you don't come to the ceremony. No offense. I just think it could be complicated." I didn't ask what complicated meant. I didn't beg. I didn't fight. I responded, "Okay, I understand. I love you." I put the phone down. Then I walked out to the garden and pulled weeds for 2 hours until my back ached and the sun dipped below the fence line. Everyone assumed I'd be at the graduation. Neighbors, coworkers, even my sister called asking what I was wearing to the ceremony. I told them I wasn't going. Some looked surprised, some pitied me, but I wasn't broken. Not anymore. Something was still alive inside me, a small spark buried under the ashes. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Because sometimes you don't slam the door. You just quietly walk away and close it behind you. Graduation day arrived like a storm I saw coming but couldn't avoid. I knew the date. I had it marked in a small notebook circled in red from back when I still thought I'd be there cheering in the crowd, crying happy tears, as my son walked across that stage. Instead, I woke up that morning in silence. No flight to catch. No dress laid out on the bed. No flowers to carry or camera to pack. Just the same old coffee mug and the hum of the refrigerator as I stared out the kitchen window at the garden I'd started digging after his message. The message that told me not to come. The sun was bright, almost insultingly so. It felt wrong to have such a beautiful day on the calendar when I felt so small, so invisible. I kept checking the time like I was late for something, but I wasn't going anywhere. Around noon, I made myself a sandwich and sat in front of the television. Not to watch the ceremony, I wasn't even sure if it was being streamed, but just to have some noise in the house. Something to fill the silence. A laugh track, a commercial jingle, anything. I tried to distract myself, but the truth was, everything hurt. It wasn't just about the ceremony. It was the weight of everything leading up to it. The years of sacrifice. The nights I stayed up sewing buttons back onto his shirts. The double shifts I worked so he could have new soccer cleats. The second job I never told him about because I didn't want him to worry. It all felt like it had been erased with one sentence. "Please don't come." I found myself going through old boxes. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to remind myself that the love I gave was real, that it existed, even if it wasn't reflected back at me now. I pulled out a shoebox from the hall closet. Inside were school pictures, Mother's Day cards written in crayon, a few macaroni crafts I'd somehow managed not to throw away. At the very bottom was a photo of Zach and me at his high school graduation, my arm around his shoulder, his face beaming with pride. He wanted me there then. What had changed? I didn't want to cry. I told myself I wouldn't. I wanted to be strong, the kind of strong I had always been. But grief doesn't care about plans. It comes in waves, and when it hits, it doesn't knock. I curled up on the floor next to that open box and wept, not just for the ceremony I was missing, but for every moment of closeness that had quietly vanished. I cried for the little boy who used to draw me superheroes and label them Mom. I cried for the woman I used to be, the one who thought unconditional love meant never asking for anything back. And I cried because deep down, I knew this wasn't just about a day. It was about being left behind, being forgotten, being made to feel like love was something to be ashamed of, like I was something to be ashamed of. The worst part, I had no one to tell. My own mother had passed years ago. My sister Carla had tried to reach out, but I kept pushing her away. Friends at work didn't really know Zach. They all just nodded when I mentioned him, assuming we were fine, and I didn't want to explain it. I didn't want anyone to look at me the way I was starting to look at myself, like a woman who had given too much, loved too hard, and ended up with an empty chair at the most important moment of her son's life. Later that evening, I sat outside on the porch with a cup of tea. The air smelled like lilacs, and somewhere in the neighborhood, someone was grilling. Laughter floated through the air, the kind of casual joy that makes you feel more alone by contrast. I looked up at the sky and whispered, "Was I really that embarrassing?" There was no answer, just the breeze rustling the leaves. That was my lowest point. Not because I was alone, but because, for the first time in my life, I started to believe I had been foolish to love as hard as I did. I started to believe that maybe I had done something wrong, that maybe I was the problem. I didn't scream. I didn't break anything. I just sat in that silence, letting the ache settle into my bones. It was a quiet kind of rock bottom, the kind that doesn't make a sound when it breaks you. The day after graduation, I didn't want to check my phone. There were probably photos being posted, celebratory videos, smiling families wrapped in each other's arms, while I sat in a house that had grown too quiet. I told myself not to look, that it wouldn't do any good. But curiosity has a way of creeping in when your heart is broken and your hands are idle. So I picked up my phone, opened Facebook, and started scrolling. My sister Carla had tagged me in a "Thinking of You Today" post with a heart. I scrolled past it quickly, too tender, too close. Then saw a post from one of Zach's high school friends, a live stream link from the university's official graduation ceremony. It had already happened, but the video was still there saved. I hesitated, and for a moment, my thumb hovered over the screen, unsure. Watching him walk the stage would be salt in a wound I was barely holding together. But then I tapped it. The screen opened to a wide shot of the stage rows of students in caps and gowns, faculty lined up in academic robes. Applause, cheering laughter, all the sounds of a milestone I wasn't invited to share. The camera panned across the audience. I scanned the crowd instinctively, looking for myself, even though I knew I wouldn't be there. And then it cut to the podium. A name was announced. Zachary Rivers, graduating with honors in business and strategic communication. I didn't expect to feel anything, but there he was, my son, standing tall, dressed in his robe cap, tilted slightly to one side. My chest tightened. His smile looked stiff, like it had taken effort to put on. I leaned in, then the unexpected happened. He didn't just take his diploma and leave the stage. He adjusted the mic, cleared his throat, and stayed there. He looked out at the crowd for a long second, and then said, "Before I begin, I need to acknowledge someone who isn't here today." I froze. He was gripping the edges of the podium now. His voice wavered slightly. "I asked my mother not to come to this graduation." The crowd went silent. Zach took a breath, and I saw his jaw clench the same way it used to when he was trying not to cry during difficult soccer matches. I told her it might be better less complicated. I was embarrassed not of her, but of what other people might think of where I came from, and I've never been more ashamed of myself than I am today. My hands started shaking. I didn't know whether to pause the video, rewind it, or throw the phone across the room. Zach continued, voice thick with emotion. "My mom raised me by herself. She worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs. She skipped meals when money was tight. She missed doctor's appointments because she couldn't afford both of us going. She stayed up with me when I had night terrors. She held me when my dad left. She never complained, not once." He paused, and I left her behind. He looked down for a moment, then back up at the crowd. "She's not here today because of me. Because I was too afraid of how people would look at me if they saw where I came from. But my mother is the strongest, most selfless, most extraordinary woman I've ever known, and I failed her." A few people in the crowd clapped, then more, then everyone. I sat there on the couch, frozen phone still in my hand. I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not joy, exactly, and not relief. It was something more complicated. a quiet breaking open, a release. He hadn't said my name, but he had said everything I needed to hear. I played it again just to be sure. Not because I didn't believe him, but because I needed to believe that maybe, just maybe, the person I raised was still in there somewhere. Somewhere beneath the polish and distance. Somewhere beneath the pride and pressure. The little boy who once wrote me Mother's Day cards and glitter glue had found a way to speak again. Publicly. Honestly. Without anyone forcing him to. It wasn't an apology in the form of a message or a phone call. It wasn't personal, not yet. But it was something. Something real. And that was the moment the shift began. Not in him, but in me. Because before I had believed that I had lost him for good. But in that speech on that stage to that crowd, my son had pulled back the curtain. And in doing so, he'd let just enough light in for me to see that I wasn't invisible. I was still there. He'd just forgotten how to look. Something changed after I watched that video. Not right away. It wasn't like a lightning strike or a movie-style revelation. It was slower, quieter, more like standing in the middle of a cold gray winter and suddenly realizing the snow is starting to melt. The next morning, I didn't wake up feeling angry. I didn't feel victorious either. I just felt aware. Aware of the silence in the house, yes, but also aware of the warmth returning somewhere inside me. The weight I had been dragging behind me for weeks felt a little lighter. The sadness didn't vanish, but it settled like dust after a long storm. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where I had spent so many mornings crying over what had been lost. Only this time, I wasn't crying. I watched the sunlight come through the window and land on the floor beside me. That light used to feel harsh, but now it felt soft. I opened my old journal, the one I used to write in before things got too heavy. I hadn't touched it in months. The last entry was from Zach's sophomore year, a list of things I was grateful for. I remember forcing myself to write that day because I thought gratitude could cure everything. This time, I didn't force anything. I just started writing. He said I wasn't there, but he talked about me. Maybe that's a beginning. Maybe I don't need to chase anymore. Maybe it's time I come back to myself. That was the start of something. That afternoon, I went to the garden and pulled weeds, but this time not out of grief or distraction. I planted new seedlings. Tomatoes, carrots, and a row of sunflowers that would bloom by late summer. I hadn't grown sunflowers since Zach was little. They were his favorite. He used to call them happy flowers. I smiled at the memory, but I didn't feel the ache that usually followed. It was just a good memory. Then I cleaned out the guest room, the one he and Emily had stayed in during their last visit. I stripped the bed, donated the bedding, vacuumed the corners, and opened the window wide. The room had felt like a tomb ever since that visit. Now it just felt like a space I could repurpose. Not for them. For me? Maybe I'd turn it into a reading nook, or an art room, or a space to meditate. It was mine now, and that was the awakening. The realization that I had given so much of myself away, that I'd forgotten I was still here. Still whole. Still worth something. My value hadn't disappeared just because someone else had stopped seeing it. I had been living as if Zach's love defined me, as if being needed was the same as being loved, as if motherhood meant erasing everything else that made me me. But what if I could be more than just the mother he used to adore? What if I could be someone I admired? That night, I cooked dinner. Not stew. Not something he used to love. Just something I liked. Garlic butter, shrimp with rice, and a lemony salad. I ate alone, at the table, with a lit candle and a folded napkin and a glass of iced tea. Not because anyone was watching, just because I deserved to feel special in my own home. I took a walk afterward, just around the block. The air was crisp. The trees starting to bloom again. A neighbor waved at me. And for once, I didn't rush back inside to hide from the world. I waved back. By the time I returned home, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Steady. I didn't need to call Zach. I didn't need him to know what I was doing. I didn't need his approval to feel like I mattered. The fire that had been burning low for months was starting to glow again. And for the first time in a long time, I realized this wasn't about whether or not he came back to me. It was about whether or not I came back to myself. He might reach out. He might not. That wasn't in my control. But I could choose to stop shrinking in the shadows of someone else's life. I could choose to grow again, even if it was slow, even if no one noticed. Because sometimes awakening doesn't come with a bang. Sometimes it comes with a breath. And I was finally ready to take one. After the shift inside me, that quiet awakening, I didn't announce anything to anyone. Not to Zach. Not to Carla. Not to my coworkers who asked gently if I was doing okay. I didn't post inspirational quotes on Facebook or share videos about reclaiming your identity. I didn't write long captions or send long texts. Instead, I went silent. Not out of anger, but out of intention. Because when you finally start healing, you don't need to prove anything. You just begin. The first thing I did was clean out my bedroom closet. Not because it was messy, but because it was full of a version of me I no longer wanted to carry. I donated blouses I had held onto in case Zach took me to dinner one day. I tossed the old scarf Emily had once complimented, the one I wore the last time they visited hoping to seem presentable. I boxed up shoes that hurt my feet but made me look polished, and I bought myself a new pair of sneakers. Not fancy, just comfortable. Something I could walk miles in without hurting. Because I planned to walk again. Maybe not away from something this time, but towards something. I started going to the community center on Wednesdays. They offered a free watercolor class. I hadn't painted since high school, and the first time I picked up the brush, my hand trembled. But by the third session, I was mixing my own colors and filling the page without hesitation. I painted a field of sunflowers, once the tall, proud kind, and took it home in a paper frame. I pinned it on the wall above the kitchen sink where the old family calendar used to hang. I also started writing in my journal every night. Just a few lines. Some days it was mundane, rain today or bought more mulch. But other days, something would pour out of me unfiltered and honest. He doesn't know I saw the speech. That's okay. I don't need a ribbon or a spotlight. I just need to stay awake. I opened a new savings account too, quietly. I'd been meaning to do it for years, but all my extra money always went to Zach. Books, clothes, bus fare, groceries. It felt strange to think about money just for me. I put in $100 to start. The teller smiled and asked, "Any plans for this account?" I smiled back and said, "Not yet, but there will be." Then there was the garden. Each morning, I walked out barefoot onto the porch with a mug of coffee and just stood there watching it grow. The tomatoes started to show green shoots. The sunflowers had sprouted tall and straight. I added a bird feeder and watched as sparrows and finches started to visit. It was peaceful, but more than that, it was mine. I didn't text Zach, not when he posted graduation pictures, not when Emily shared a post about their upcoming move to Chicago. I didn't need to say anything. I didn't need to ask questions or drop hints or send articles that reminded me of him. I had loved him fiercely, fully, and I still did. But I no longer needed to be in his line of sight to feel like I had value. The most powerful thing I did was the smallest. I stopped waiting for a call, waiting for an apology, waiting for some perfect moment where he'd appear at my door and say all the right things. I had lived too much of my life in the waiting room of other people's recognition. Now I was building something on my own terms. Carla noticed first. She came over one afternoon with a lemon tart and said, "You seem different." I shrugged and smiled. "Maybe I'm just tired of being sad." She hugged me hard and didn't let go. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't pull away. When she left, I made myself a cup of tea, went outside, and stood barefoot again on the porch. The garden was in bloom. A bird landed near the feeder and sang. I didn't speak. I didn't need to, because the setup had already begun. Not for revenge, not for some big comeback, but for peace. And peace doesn't make noise when it arrives. It just fills the space where pain used to live and quietly, confidently makes itself at home. Something strange happens when you stop chasing people. They notice. Not always right away. Not with an apology or a knock at your door. But eventually, when the silence stretches longer than they expected, when you no longer show up in the background of their lives, they start to feel it. That's what happened with Zach. It started subtly. A text message, short, cautious. Hey Mom, hope you're okay? Graduation went well. Just wanted to check in. I read it and felt nothing, not anger, not joy. Just a calm sense of knowing. I didn't rush to reply. I set the phone down, brewed a cup of tea, and went outside to water the garden. An hour later, I texted back. I'm glad to hear that. I'm doing well. Hope Chicago is treating you kindly. That was it. No questions, no open doors. Just a simple acknowledgement. The next day, he sent a photo of his new apartment. Exposed brick walls, plants on the windowsill. It looked nice, cold, but nice. I didn't respond to the photo. He didn't ask anything. It felt like he was testing the waters, throwing out little threads to see if I'd pull on them. But I didn't. I wasn't trying to teach him a lesson. I was just finally living one. The power had shifted. Not because I'd gained something, but because I'd stopped giving everything away. The old version of me would have seen his texts as an invitation, a sign to fold myself back into his life, to prove I was still useful, still loving, still here. This version of me didn't need proof. At work, I started picking up different shifts, not to earn more for him, but to save for a weekend retreat I'd found online. Writing and gardening by the lake. It was expensive, but I'd already put $200 into my new savings account. I planned to go alone. Carla and I started walking together in the evenings. She noticed the change, too. You're not waiting anymore, she said one night as we passed by blooming rose bushes. I smiled. Number, I think I'm done with that. A few days later, I received an email. Not from Zach, but from his university. Apparently, he had listed me as the emergency contact, and now they were following up with parents of recent graduates to gather testimonials for a campaign. The message included a link to a video. The graduation speech I'd already watched. The one where Zach spoke about me. But this time, there was a note from the dean attached. Your son's words moved the entire auditorium. We wanted to share it with you personally in case you missed it. I read it twice. Then I forwarded the message to Carla with a simple note. I didn't miss it. I just didn't need the whole room to know. Zach called that weekend. I let it ring the first time. He called again 2 hours later, and this time I answered. Hey, he said. His voice was soft, careful. Hi. I've been meaning to call. Things have just been crazy with the move. It's all right. A pause. I don't know if you saw the graduation video. I did. Another pause. You weren't supposed to see that. I didn't know it was being recorded. I let him sit with that. Well, I meant every word he said eventually. I know you did. He exhaled. I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. I was so focused on who I was trying to become, I forgot who made me. I didn't cry. I didn't tell him it was okay, or that everything was fixed. I just said thank you. He asked if he could visit in a few weeks. I said I'd have to check my schedule. It wasn't about being petty. It was about being real. I had built a life that no longer revolved around waiting for him to come home. That night, I sat on the porch, watching the wind dance through the sunflowers. I felt something loosen in my chest, a kind of quiet authority. Not control over anyone else, just control over me. The woman who once begged for inclusion was now the woman being invited. The mother who had been asked to stay home was now choosing whether to open her door. And somewhere in that shift, I understood what real power looks like. It doesn't yell. It doesn't chase. It stands tall in its own soil and says, I'm still here, and I'm not afraid of being alone anymore. Zach arrived 2 weeks later. He called from the driveway, not a text, not a knock, a phone call. I let it ring twice before answering. A quiet part of me still tensed, expecting the old dynamic. Him asking for something, me rushing to meet it. But this time was different. Hey, Mom, I'm here, he said. I see you, I replied, looking through the curtain. He stepped out of the car, slowly wearing a navy button-up and jeans. He looked older, but not in a bad way, just more settled. There was no girlfriend on his arm, no distractions, just him. When I opened the front door, we didn't hug right away. We stood facing each other in the sunlight for a moment, both unsure of how to begin. I didn't fill the space with nervous chatter. I let the silence stretch. He was the one who broke it. You painted the door? He said, nodding toward the front. It used to be white. It's sunflower yellow now, I said. Felt like time for a change. He smiled slightly, then followed me inside. I'd cleaned, but not in the performative way I used to. No special candles, no desperate display of warmth. Just my home as it was comfortable lived in, and more importantly, mine. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table that had once been set for him with his favorite stew, the same one where I had cried alone on graduation day. Now it was just 2 cups of coffee between us. No dramatics, no prepared speeches. So he began staring into his cup. I meant what I said at the graduation. I know. I wasn't sure you saw it. I did. He shifted in his seat. I was a coward. I didn't want to admit that I'd been ashamed not of you, of myself, of what it meant to be seen with someone who didn't fit the image I was chasing. There it was not just guilt ownership. I nodded. That shame didn't come from me, Zach. It came from who you thought you had to be accepted. I never asked you to be ashamed. I gave you everything I had so you could stand tall, not so you could hide where you came from. He looked up, eyes shining. I know that now. We sat for a moment, letting that truth breathe. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a thin-bound book. He slid it across the table. What's this I wrote about you? He said. It started as a class project, but I kept working on it. I sent it to a few publishers. A small press picked it up. They're calling it a hybrid memoir. I turned the book over in my hands. The title read, The Seat in the Back Row. He cleared his throat. It's about how I made you sit in the shadows and how wrong I was. The last chapter is your story, not mine. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped through the pages. It wasn't about the publication. It wasn't even about the writing. It was about being seen. Finally, fully, with nothing hidden or softened. I want you to know, he said gently. I'm not here to erase what happened. I can't, but I want to rebuild if you'll let me. I took a breath. I'm not the same woman who waited by the phone, I said. I'm not the same mother who dropped everything for scraps of affection. I still love you. That hasn't changed. But I don't need you to fix this for me. I've already started healing. He nodded, visibly emotional. I want to meet you where you are now, not who you used to be. And just like that, the tables turned. Not in dominance, but in understanding. This wasn't a reunion built on guilt. It was a recognition of growth. We sat there for another hour, talking like adults who respected each other. Not mother and son trapped in old roles, but 2 people choosing to reconnect on honest terms. When he left, he hugged me longer than he ever had before. He didn't ask to stay the night. He didn't try to make it perfect. He simply said, I'll come back soon if that's okay with you. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a mother waiting at the window. I felt like a woman standing in her power, being chosen, not needed. And that in itself was the reveal I never saw coming. A few weeks after Zach's visit, I received an email from a woman named Dana Levy. She introduced herself as an editor at a small but growing publishing house based out of Vermont. She'd read Zach's memoir, The Seat in the Back Row, and wanted to speak with me directly. Her message was warm and curious. Your son speaks about you with such complexity and reverence. We're planning a campaign centered on unsung women whose stories shape the lives of remarkable people. Would you be open to a conversation? At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted to be part of Zach's narrative again. For so long, I had been the invisible force, the ghost in the background who cooked, sacrificed, endured. And I wasn't sure I was ready to step into the light now that the world was watching. But curiosity won. We set up a video call. Dana appeared on screen, a cheerful woman in her late 30s with sharp eyes and an easy laugh. She asked thoughtful questions not just about Zach, but about me, my story, my decisions, my regrets, and the years between the milestones. She listened like it all mattered. After the call, she followed up quickly. We're launching a campaign called Mothers Who Built Us. We'd love to feature you. A portrait, a short essay in your own words, and maybe a local interview. Nothing intrusive, just real. I stared at her words for a long time. For decades, my story had lived behind someone else's spotlight, behind Zach's achievements, behind the sacrifices, behind the closed doors of a quiet home. But now someone wanted to amplify it. Not as an accessory to a man's success, but as something whole and worthy on its own. I said yes. They flew a small team out 2 weeks later. I borrowed a simple blouse from Carla and let the photographer take my picture in the garden near the blooming sunflowers. The interviewer sat with me at the kitchen table, the same one that had carried my pain and my healing. We spoke for hours. When the campaign launched, I didn't expect much, but it went viral. Women from across the country wrote in. Some mothers, some daughters, all of them connecting to the quiet power behind the story. Messages poured in. You reminded me of my own mother. Thank you for being honest. We see you. This made me call my mom today. I'd forgotten how much she gave. Local media picked it up. Then a national podcast requested an interview. I declined that one. I wasn't chasing fame. I just wanted my story to live somewhere. It wouldn't be erased. Then came the twist I never saw coming. One morning, I got a call from the director of a nonprofit that supports single mothers pursuing education. They had read the article, seen my portrait, and wanted to name their new scholarship fund after me. The Marlene Rivers Resilience Grant. I had to sit down. A woman who once stayed up at night wondering if she was too much or not enough, who was told, please don't come, now had her name attached to a legacy of opportunity. Not just for one son, but for dozens, maybe hundreds of children whose mothers were fighting the same unseen battles I once did. I called Zach that evening. He was quiet on the line as I told him about the campaign, the article, the scholarship. Wow, he said. I didn't know it would ripple like this. That's the thing about telling the truth, I said gently. It spreads not always fast, but eventually it finds its way. He cleared his throat. I'm proud of you, Mom. Not just because of the campaign, but because you didn't wait for me. You built something on your own. His voice broke a little. And I'm sorry it took me so long to see who you really are. I smiled into the phone, my heart full but calm. It's okay, Zach. The best kind of justice isn't loud or angry. It's living well and being seen anyway. That night, I framed the photo from the garden, the one they used in the campaign. I placed it next to Zach's high school graduation picture, not because I needed to prove anything, but because now both told the truth. He stood on a stage, and I finally stepped into the light. And in that quiet, powerful justice, I had never felt more whole. A few months after the campaign launched and the scholarship was announced, I heard a knock on my front door. It wasn't Zach. It was Emily. She stood on my porch holding a box of lemon bars, her expression equal parts nervous and sincere. She looked different, older, softer around the eyes. No phone in hand this time. She had driven 4 hours on her own. I saw the article, she said, and the campaign. I just wanted to say I was wrong. I didn't rush to respond. I simply opened the door wider and motioned her in. Not because I needed her apology, not because I was eager to forgive, but because I had grown enough to know that sometimes people come back not for redemption, but for understanding. She sat at the kitchen table, the same place she once laughed off my stew and smirked at our grace. This time, she didn't smirk. She didn't talk much at all. She listened. "I didn't know what you'd been through," she said quietly. "Zach never told me. And when I met you, I assumed things based on clothes, your house, your job. I thought I knew everything, but I didn't know anything." I nodded. Most people don't until life humbles them. She smiled, a little tears in her eyes. It humbled me. We shared tea and lemon bars, not as friends, not as family, just as two women sitting in truth. When she left, I walked her to the door, and she hugged me tightly this time, without hesitation. Zach called later that night. "I heard she came by," he said. "She did. Thank you for seeing her. I didn't do it for you." "I know," he said, "but I'm glad you did it anyway." His voice had matured, not just deeper, calmer. He talked about his job, how he'd started volunteering with the same nonprofit that had named the scholarship after me. He didn't call as often as some sons might, and that was okay. Our relationship wasn't built on constant communication anymore. It was built on earned respect. He didn't need to come home every holiday, and I didn't sit by the window waiting. When he did visit, he helped in the garden. He'd ask for advice. He'd tell me stories from his work. And we would laugh together again, not like before, but better. Like two people who had both learned what real love costs. One spring morning, nearly a year after that text telling me not to come to his graduation, I stood alone in my backyard. The sunflowers had bloomed again, tall, golden, unashamed. I watched the wind move through them like fingers combing through hair. The bird feeder swayed gently, and a cardinal landed to peck at the seeds. I smiled. I'd read somewhere that cardinals meant someone was watching over you. Maybe that was true. Maybe I was just at peace. Inside, my phone buzzed with new messages. A student from Texas had been awarded the Marlene Rivers Resilience Grant and wanted to thank me. She was studying to be a nurse. A single mom. Said my story reminded her that being overlooked doesn't mean being unworthy. I replied, "You're not invisible. Keep going." Then I made myself breakfast. 2 eggs, rye toast, blackberry jam. I poured a glass of orange juice and sat at the kitchen table. This time alone, but not lonely. I looked up at the wall across from me. The framed photo from the garden hung there. The one they used for the campaign. Below it, I'd added a quote from one of my journal entries. "I am not what was left behind. I am what survived." I didn't need closure in the way I once thought. I didn't need an ending tied in a bow or a relationship that looked picture perfect. What I had was deeper, a sense of self that no longer crumbled in silence, a love that wasn't desperate, a peace that didn't come from others, but from me. Because in the end, the story wasn't about being invited to a graduation. It was about learning how to rise from the seat in the back row and finally take your place at the front, even if you had to build the stage yourself.